Hi there. I'm Guillem Belmar. I'm a PhD student here at the Department of Linguistics at UCSB. And I'm coming here today with a lecture or a small discussion on phonetics and language acquisition and how our knowledge of phonetics can explain some things on language acquisition and vice versa. So language acquisition is an area that I have some interest in, mostly in L2, but also in first language acquisition, which is what we will be dealing with today. So before we actually go into this is just remember the vocal tract. So I'm sure that you've all seen this. You've all seen an image like this. So this is a mid-sagittal section, and we can see the articulators here. So if we go in order, we have them here from 1 to 14. So this goes 1 to 7 here and then 8 to 14. And we've got the upper lip and the upper teeth. Then we've got the alveolar ridge, the hard palate, soft palate or velum, the uvula, and then we've got the epiglottis here. Sorry, the glottis is down. There's the epiglottis, and then you've got the lower lip, the lower teeth, and then we've got the tongue here with the tongue tip, the tongue blade, body, dorsum, and then root. Yeah. The epiglottis, by the way, here, this is extremely important in many reasons. For speech, not a lot of languages do have epiglottal sounds, but the epiglottis is this thing here that blocks off the conduct that leads to the lungs when we eat, right? So we don't breathe in food when we're trying to swallow something. So it's important to, okay, so these are all the articulators. It's important to realize here that this is how what our vocal tracts look like. So we've got lips, we've got the tongue here. This is the oral cavity, the nasal cavity up there. And we've got here the pharynx, which is quite big, and the epiglottis, which is quite low in comparison to the vocal tract, to the oral cavity, right? The epiglottis is quite low, okay? So this is essential to understand a lot of the things that happen when we acquire language. Again, this is another picture of the vocal tract, but this time with the nasal cavity and a little bit more detailed. So again, the pharynx here is quite big and the epiglottis is low in comparison to the oral cavity. And the epiglottis here, you can see that it either blocks the respiratory conduct or it just doesn't block anything. It's just here. And this would be, by the way, this leads to your stomach. So this is where we swallow stuff and this is where we breathe air. Okay, but obviously we are not born with this vocal tract, right? The vocal tract develops over time and babies' vocal tracts are very different. And that explains a lot of the things that babies do when they acquire language. Okay, so let's look at this now. You have here a reminder of the adult vocal tract. So you have the jaws here, and then again the mouth, well the mouth. So you have the lips, the teeth, and the tongue, and then the epiglottis down here. But if we look at the vocal tract of a baby here, this is the vocal tract of a baby. It's very different. We can see that, well, first of all, there's no teeth. Okay, fine, we know that. Then you have the hard palate and the soft palate here. That's okay, it's similar-ish. It's not the same as in there's a curvature here that it's not in ours, but that's still pretty much okay. You've got a tongue that is very big in comparison to the rest. The babies have a very large tongue in comparison to the overall capacity of their oral cavity. So they have limited distinctive movement with the tongue, especially the tongue blade. You cannot really, we as adults can do a lot of things with our tongue, and that's why we have so many different places of articulation and manners of articulation that we have. And that's because our tongue is a very flexible muscle and we can use it in lots of different ways. But babies cannot do that because the tongue is too large for their oral cavity. There's also this, the Guillem is very close together with the larynx. You need that for breathing in babies because the jaw is very low. There's a very short pharynx. The pharynx here is extremely short, and the epiglottis is raised. It's very high in comparison to what we have, right? If you look at this, the epiglottis is all the way here, and the pharynx is all of this. Whereas here, the epiglottis is almost touching the soft palate, right? It's very, very high. The pharynx is extremely short, and it's basically the root of the tongue here that it's also very short. So what that does, and why babies have it, um, babies are actually better equipped, if you want, for breathing than we are, in the sense that babies cannot choke. It's almost impossible, or it's actually physically possible for babies to choke. The epiglottis is either blocking the oral cavity, or it's blocking the respiratory conduct. That's in babies from born to between 4 and 6 months old. But that has also a lot of consequences with the sounds that babies can produce. So yeah, as the vocal tract develops, we start producing more and more sounds and wider range of these sounds. First thing we produce are stops. Oral and nasal stops are the first thing we produce, our speech sounds or speechy sounds. Nasal stops in particular come first. We'll see later why. But yeah, stops would be the first thing that we produce. And then at around 6 months old, canonical babbling, or what's called canonical babbling, starts. This is a good moment to point out that this is a description of, if you want, canonical babies. It's a description of babies that follow the canonical development, and we're talking about oral language acquisition as well. There are parallels to this, the sign language acquisition, which we're not going to get into, but there are parallels, and we can gesture. It's just that we're going to focus a lot on the vocal tract, and we're talking about normal development, which is how this is normally labeled. So canonical babbling starts with its mostly combinations of CV, that is consonant, vowel, and in these cases, the consonant is almost always a stop, because we said before the stop is the first thing that is acquired, and you can start thinking about what vowel is the most common vowel in babies. You probably have a good intuition on that, and there's also an explanation of why that is. And then there's vocal play. All this period is full of vocal play. That is when babies just produce a variety of sounds, be them speech or non-speech sounds, just sounds in general, and they just play with it, and yeah, they just play with these sounds and see what they can do and how people react to these sounds, and just discovering their vocal tract a little bit. Like, I don't know if you've been doing this for your production exam, that I know you have. A little bit like that, like trying to, okay, how am I supposed to do this sound? So we do it very consciously, but basically babies are playing with their vocal tract and see what they can do with it. Okay, so when I talk about vocal play, I'm talking about this. So I'm gonna share this clip of this baby doing cute baby sounds. And this is what I mean by vocal play. And you can see that there's some speech sounds there, but also a lot of non-speech sounds. And there's some constant vowel, if you want. There's only one that tends to be happening. Okay, so this was a bit loud. Okay, so that's an example of vocal play. So we could see that this baby was doing some speech sounds. There was a particular vowel that was happening there, but there was also a lot of non-speech sounds. Yeah, a lot of if you want fart noises the baby was doing with the mouth. Again, playing and discovering the vocal tract, what it looks like, what it is, what it feels like, and what sounds can be produced with it. Okay, so the first vowel that we produce as we saw in the baby is basically schwa, or this also this low central a. And there's an articulatory reason for this. So we have to ask ourselves, why is this the first vowel? Why is or normally the first one? Why is this schwa the first vowel we ever produce? And why not e or u? Why is that? It's basically because these are the two vowels, especially schwa, but also the low central a, that they require the least amount of coordination. If you think about it, to produce an u, you need to move your tongue. You need to raise the back of your tongue. So because it's a back vowel, right? So you need to raise the back of your tongue, and then you need to round your lips. Ooh, right? So there's coordination happening here. We need to do something with the tongue, something with your lips, and also the tongue has to actually move from its normal position. The same for an E, you will not have to round your lips, but you have to move the tongue from position and then raise it. Whereas for schwa and a, you basically you barely have to move your tongue. Yeah, they require the least amount of movement from the default vocal tract. If you just don't move your vocal tract from the default position, you are producing a schwa. Yeah, and if you move slightly, so if you move your tongue a little bit, or you lower it a little bit, you produce an a, right? So these are the two vowels that are the easiest vowels to make, and that's the articulatory explanation of why babies first acquire the vowel and a. So we said that first we acquire stops. When we talk about consonants, stops are the first ones, and then we move on to other sounds, especially difficult sounds like rhotics, like r in English, the approximant ara, or the trills in Spanish, arra. So these are very complex sounds. These are much more complicated, and they are not mastered until later in life. That's why you have like children that are 6 or 7 years old that have problems with rhotics. Is a very common thing, and that also has some ties in with the SLP guest lecture that you also had. So a lot of SLP interventions are around rhotics and fricatives because these are difficult sounds across languages to acquire. So you have the rhotics and you have the fricatives, be like S or so the sibilants is very common, but also other kinds of fricatives. Sometimes for fricatives, the problem might be the place of articulation, that it's difficult to master. Other times, voicing in fricatives is also complicated because of the pressure needed to make the vocal cords vibrate. So there are a lot of articulatory reasons that explain why all these things take much more time to be acquired. One interesting observation is that consonant acquisition is more similar across languages than vowel acquisition. So that basically means that we normally acquire first the schwa and then the a vowel, but what vowels we acquire later on in life do depend a lot on the vowels that we get as input, right? So an English child, because a is not really a phoneme in English, it tends to appear much fronted in adult speech, so it tends to be more like a. This English child that constantly gets this will get the a much faster than another language that may have an e contrastively, and in that case, the vowel may take longer to be acquired. Right. Also important to notice here that babies acquire the perception of these differences very early on. Okay, we're talking about production here. Perception, very early on, babies learn and acquire the distinction of these things. If some distinction is okay, let's do it differently. Or babies are very, very well equipped to identify sounds. Now, if we could if we could train a baby to do IPA transcription, that would be amazing because they're very good at it. I mean, not at doing IPA transcription, but at recognizing the sounds. So they're very good at recognizing differences between sounds. And very early on, what they do is they focus on the distinctions that are meaningful in the languages they get input in. Um, so if a language has a distinction between a and e, that distinction, the baby knows it and the baby can perceive it and can process it. It's another thing. And it might take a little bit longer. Okay. So let's look at this. If we said that stops are the first thing we acquire, and the vowel a or schwa is also the first vowels we acquire. Now, let's take a look at these words. Now, these are a series of words for mom and dad. And we have here American English, mom and dad, but also we have Welsh, mom and dad, French, maman and papa, German, mama and papa, Spanish, mama and papa, even though mama and papa are also possible, Catalan, mama and papa. So we have a lot of words that are very, very similar here, right? But you can say, well, all these are actually in the European languages, so maybe all these words are related and go back to a common ancestor. But there's also other languages that have very similar words for mom and dad, right? Mandarin has mama and baba. Tagalog has nanay and tatay. Swahili has mama and baba. Chechen has nana and da. Inuktitut, spoken in North America, from Alaska to Greenland, has anana and atata. Kwasati, spoken in Louisiana, has mama and tata. Pipil has nan and tata. And Yukonani Mixtec has nana and tata. So these are not in the European languages, right? These are not related, and these words are not exactly borrowings. These are just the words for mom and dad in these languages. So how is it that we have in all these different languages very similar words for mom and dad? Well, it has to do with everything we just said. It has to do with articulatory reasons. It has to do with the vocal tract of babies. It's not that these languages are related. That's not what it is. And also the similarities between these words don't really give us any evidence that there was some proto-world or proto-word that every human ever used for mom and dad. That's not what's happening here. Phonetics is giving us the answer. Articulatory phonetics is giving us the answer. The characteristics of our vocal tracts as babies is what makes these words the common words, the words for mom and dad. Because these syllables, ma, pa, na, ta, all these syllables are some of the first syllables that babies ever produce because of the characteristics of their vocal tracts. The low central vowel, as we said, is the easiest vowel to produce. So and schwa. So this is normal. We say we saw that almost all those words had an a in it, right? Nasal stops are simpler than oral stops. So mama is simpler than papa because the lower velum is the default. Like when we're resting, the velum is lowered. So what we actually do is lower. Well, it's actually in its normal position. What we actually have to do is raising it to block the nasal airflow. So babies take a long time to raising that. Probably like from 7 months old or something like that, they start raising and they start discovering that they can raise the velum. So nasal stops are simpler. That's why mama and nana and all these things are probably the first syllables they produce, and commonly the word for mother. And I say commonly because that's not true in all languages. There's actually some languages like Georgian, for instance, where mama is father and data is mother, so it's the other way around. But in general, the nasal stop is associated with the mother. In fact, talking about nasals, there's also the fact that babies, if you remember the vocal tract of babies that we saw at the very beginning, the larynx is much higher than in adults. And so the epiglottis is also much higher. And as we mentioned at the beginning, the epiglottis blocks the pulmonic airflow from the oral cavity. That is because babies, as I said, like babies, the epiglottis is either closing the lungs off so they can swallow and they never ever choke, or the epiglottis is actually closing the oral cavity off. So if they're breathing, the vocal cavity is closed, and that's until they are 4 to 6 months old when it starts to lower. So in other words, that means the newborns actually physically cannot produce a sound that is not nasal. Sounds are nasals with newborns because physically it's impossible for them to have airflow coming out of the lungs through the oral cavity because the epiglottis will be blocking the oral cavity. Okay, but that explains the stops, that explains the nasality, and that explains the vowel. But why ma, ba, or ba? Why all these are so common? We also have some languages that have na and da. So, like English has mum, but then it has dad. But in general, it's a lot of bilabial consonants. And why is it? This has a very easy explanation. First, there's several explanations here. Like first one would be that, as we said, the tongue has more restrictive movements, so it's actually easier to use your lips because the tongue it's much bigger than it should be in relation to the oral cavity, and therefore it takes much more effort to actually move it. But it's a very simple explanation is because we can see bilabial consonants being made. If an adult is talking to us and says ma, we can actually see the mouth closing and then opening. So babies can imitate that much more easily because it's something we can see. Okay, and the final point we'll be making here is that acquisition of prosody, which is something very important and that you probably mentioned in the last weeks. Prosody is acquired very early on, which is maybe surprising. Children babble with prosodic patterns of the language they hear. 6 to 8 months old, the prosodic pattern of the baby is recognizable as the prosodic pattern of the native language or languages of the baby. Just one more note here, native languages. This is also very important to highlight that multilingual babies don't acquire languages separately, right? When a baby is acquiring 2 or 3 or 4 or more languages, they acquire them all together as one linguistic system, and then later on in life, the baby will start making the differences and separating these systems. But at first, they are all acquired at once. An example here that I would like to share, and it's kind of related to prosody, is that so I acquired I acquired Spanish and Catalan growing up, so I was a quote unquote bilingual baby, and the dominant or the one that I heard the most at home was Catalan, but I acquired Spanish also, like in cartoons and TV and the street, and a couple of uncles that also spoke Spanish to me. So I acquired both languages, and at first you don't have this distinction. And both Spanish and Catalan are languages that have lexical stress, which, if you remember from the lectures on stress, it's languages where stress is unpredictable and it actually can create minimal pairs. So both these languages have lexical stress, but lexical stress functions differently in these languages because lexical stress in Spanish is mostly that the stress vowel is longer, and lexical stress in Catalan works the stress vowel, it's longer than the rest, yes, but because the rest get reduced, often to a very schwa-like sound, right? So something like fabrica, which in Spanish is él fabrica, that means he makes something. And in Catalan, it's the same word, but because stress works differently, it would be fabrica. So you go for a schwa-like sound. And when I was acquiring these two languages, because I was acquiring them at the same time, what I did was I applied this reduction rule to everything I was doing. And I actually did this until pretty late in my life, like probably was 8 or 9 years old, that I was still reducing syllables in Spanish. And then I started, realizing that was not the case. So you acquire all these things together, and in some cases, and again, this has a nice tie-in with SLP. In some cases, some people may think, oh, this is not normal development. This kid needs to learn that this doesn't happen, that unstressed syllables in Spanish don't get reduced, and therefore maybe the kid has some problem learning language. No, the kid has no problem learning languages. The kid has two languages and is applying one rule of one language to everything he has. And it needs some time to start teasing them apart, right? And so this has to do with prosody. So probably that means I very early on learned that unstressed things were reduced. And then it took me a while to realize that that doesn't map on to every language the same way. Okay, so having said that, acquisition of prosody, we said it's acquired very early on. This is also true for tone. Tone in tonal languages is also acquired very early on. The acquisition of tone has some good parallels with the acquisition of other features of vowels, such as like a vowel length that is phonemic or vowel nasality, etc. The acquisition of tone, in general, high tones and low tones are acquired early on, and then rising tones, and finally falling tones. And tonal languages that have unspecified tones, so that is tonal languages that have syllables where there's no tone, that no tone takes longer to acquire also. But yeah, tone, you start acquiring tone also very early on. At 6, 8 months old, you start acquiring tone. And I'm gonna share this video with you. This is two twin babies talking to each other. You'll see they're still babbling, but there's a lot of prosody going on, to the point that you can actually recognize the prosody here. You can see that the parents probably speak English to these kids. You can recognize the prosodic patterns. You can recognize questions, and you can even, there's a moment in the video, early on in the video, where one of them says, clearly no. So he's clearly negating something. Doesn't say no, so still says ta 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 or something like that. But the prosody is clearly negation prosody that maps on very well to how an English speaker would do it. We're not going to play the whole video. You will have the link in the slides, but just a little bit so you can hear this prosody happening, and you can see how you recognize that it's very English prosody-like. Okay, so you can see how there's some units, some utterances, or some part of the babbling of the baby that has a very clear rising intonation, which reminds us of questions in English, right? And then others that have more lowering or more falling intonation that reminds us of normal, like affirmative sentences. And then this moment at the very beginning where one of them says ah, and this ah is very clear a no, right? Look, just put that again, so until the no, so you can see the prosody there, and how that actually can also remind us of the acquisition of tone if this was a tonal language. This moment here, he clearly says no, he is not having it. Okay, so that was it. Thanks for listening to this. And if you want to know more, you can take link 137, which is Introduction to First Language Acquisition in Spring. And yeah, and if you do, I'll be there and I'll be your TA for that course. Thanks. Hope you enjoyed it.